They call you ambitious, driven, a go-getter. But somewhere between the fourth Zoom call and the third skipped meal, you start to wonder, is this still motivation or just another addiction with better PR? Because here's the paradox. We celebrate productivity like a virtue, but we never ask what we're running from. Why do so many people work so much, long after the bills are paid, the goals are hit, the body's exhausted? Could it be that work, yes, work, has become our socially accepted form of escape? We talk about workaholism as if it's just a side effect of capitalism, or ambition, or poor time management. But what if it's something deeper, something existential? What if we throw ourselves into constant doing because we're terrified of being? In this video, we're not just talking about overworking. We're talking about the psychological and philosophical roots of why we need to be busy. To avoid silence, self-confrontation, and the one thing most people quietly fear, meeting their unedited selves. Buckle up. Work as escape. From self-awareness to self-avoidance. We like to think we're working towards something, a goal, a promotion, a legacy. But what if, underneath all that striving, we're actually just running away? Not from deadlines or taxes or our inbox, but from ourselves. Because while most addictions are frowned upon, work addiction gets applause. You're motivated, you're reliable, you're driven. But behind those shiny labels is something far less glamorous, a deep discomfort with stillness, a fear of what might rise to the surface if we ever stop moving. See, when you sit in silence long enough, the real questions start to show up, the ones you've pushed down with every new project and every late-night email. Questions like, am I happy? Do I know who I am when I'm not being useful? What happens if I stop proving my worth? These aren't questions you can answer with a calendar or a checklist. And that's the problem, because for a lot of us, doing is easier than being. Psychologists know this pattern well. Workaholism isn't just about loving your job, it's often about avoiding yourself. Busyness is a brilliant distraction. It gives you structure, it gives you identity, it gives you a reason to delay all the inner work that feels too big, too abstract, too frightening. The paradox, you might be exhausted, but you feel safer burned out than you do bored. Because boredom leaves space, and space unfortunately leaves room for truth. From a distance, it looks like discipline. From the inside, it feels like a treadmill you can't step off. Not because someone's forcing you to run, but because you're terrified of what the stillness might reveal. That your life is off course. That your relationships are hollow. That your success isn't satisfying. That the person you've become is someone you built for applause, not someone you actually want to be. This is the work as escape trap. The more you avoid yourself, the more addicted you become to movement. You start to equate stillness with failure. You confuse being productive with being valuable. You stop asking why and just keep asking what's next. Your whole life becomes a performance of competence, a show of busyness designed not to impress others, but to silence the inner questions that feel too big to answer. Existential philosophers saw this coming a long time ago. Søren Kierkegaard called it the despair of the finite. That quiet panic that creeps in when your life is full of activity but empty of purpose. Jean-Paul Sartre wrote about the tendency to bury ourselves in bad faith, roles, routines, labels, just to avoid confronting our radical freedom and responsibility. Viktor Frankl noted how many people run from the existential vacuum by filling their time with distraction and compulsive behaviors. And today, we call it hustle culture. But here's the twist. It's not that work is bad. Work can be meaningful, creative, purposeful. What's dangerous is when work becomes your only identity. When you don't know how to feel worthwhile without checking something off. When your entire sense of self rests on external achievement, so much so that stopping feels like dying. This is more than just burnout. This is spiritual dehydration. The body's still moving, but the soul is parched. You keep drinking from the same dry well, productivity, validation, more tasks, hoping it'll finally quench something inside. But it never does. Because the thing you're really thirsty for isn't accomplishment, it's wholeness. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Wholeness requires facing what work helps you avoid. The insecurity, the fear, the loneliness, the doubts about whether the life you've built is actually yours. Those aren't flaws, they're invitations, but we rarely accept them, because accepting them requires slowing down. And slowing down feels like failure, so we stay busy. We glorify hustle, we idolize grind, we shame rest, all while quietly hoping that if we just do a little more, work a little harder, keep the wheels spinning, we won't have to hear the sound of our own unmet selves knocking at the door. But that knock won't stop, and deep down, we know it. Which is why every late-night binge of emails, every overscheduled calendar, every Sunday filled with guilt for not being productive enough, feels less like empowerment and more like avoidance dressed up in ambition's clothing. There's no shame in this, it's human. When life feels uncertain, or when the inner world feels too messy to touch, of course we seek structure, control, direction. Work gives us all of that. But if we're not careful, we use it to build a fortress around the very parts of us that need attention, not protection. And at some point, the cost becomes too high. Relationships suffer, health declines, creativity dies. But perhaps the deepest loss is this: we lose the chance to meet ourselves beyond our usefulness. We become strangers to our own depth. So what's the alternative? It's not quitting your job. It's not rejecting structure. It's choosing to pause long enough to notice why you're so busy. It's asking uncomfortable questions without rushing to answer them. It's learning to sit in silence long enough to hear your own voice again, not the voice shaped by performance, but the one that speaks from somewhere quieter and more real. Because maybe freedom doesn't start when the to-do list is done. Maybe it starts the moment you realize the list was never going to save you. Work as escape, from self-awareness to self-avoidance. No one wakes up one day and says, I want to lose myself in spreadsheets to avoid my soul. And yet, here we are, sprinting from task to task, measuring our days in meetings and metrics, quietly terrified of what might happen if we just stopped. On the surface, it looks like drive, ambition, a solid work ethic. But beneath the calendar apps and productivity quotes, there's something more fragile: avoidance. Because if we stop moving even for a moment, we might have to confront what we've been running from. Not failure, not laziness, ourselves. Work is one of the most respectable ways to disappear from your own life. It's praised, rewarded, even envied. No one questions the person who stays late or answers emails on weekends. In fact, we call them dedicated, focused, passionate. But what if all that focus is just another form of escape? Not from the world, but from the inner world. From silence, from reflection, from the discomfort of being a person without a to-do list. Psychologically, this is classic distraction behavior. When we feel something uncomfortable rising, uncertainty, grief, existential doubt, we look for something to numb it. Some use alcohol, others scroll. But some, let's be honest, the overachievers, use work. Not because they love it, but because it keeps the monsters at bay. It gives structure, rhythm, applause. You don't have to face your loneliness if you're always in meetings. You don't have to process your childhood if your inbox is overflowing. You don't have to question the meaning of your life if there's always one more deadline to meet. This is what makes work so seductive. It doesn't just give us money or status, it gives us identity. And more dangerously, it gives us permission to ignore everything that's unresolved inside us. I can't think about that right now, I'm too busy. And just like that, you've turned your trauma into a calendar event you'll never schedule. Philosophers have seen this pattern for centuries. Kierkegaard called it the despair of busyness. A state where people fill their lives with activity precisely to avoid the anxiety of existence. Erich Fromm warned that in modern capitalist societies, we've replaced being with doing. We no longer ask who we are, we ask what we produce. And in doing so, we construct a self that only exists while working. The moment we sit still, the scaffolding collapses. Even Freud, for all his oddities, understood this. Work can be a socially acceptable neurosis. It keeps the unconscious in check, it gives the ego something to cling to. But unlike other coping mechanisms, it's one we celebrate. Overworking isn't treated as a symptom, it's treated as success. And that makes it harder to spot, harder to question, harder to escape. Because the scariest part of confronting our own mind isn't what we might find. It's the fear that without constant motion, we'll feel empty. And that emptiness, that's not a bug, that's a mirror. It reflects all the parts of ourselves we've postponed. The grief we never processed, the dreams we quietly buried, the questions we pretend are too philosophical for real life. But here's the truth, Working harder won't fill that space. It might cover it, decorate it, distract from it, but it won't heal it. Because healing doesn't happen in motion. It happens in presence, in stillness, in the uncomfortable honesty of not knowing exactly who you are without your title, your role, your hustle. Of course, none of this means work is inherently bad. Work can be meaningful, creative, even healing. But the moment it becomes your default way to avoid yourself, it stops being freedom and becomes a cage with productivity stickers on the bars. So the next time you find yourself opening your laptop at 10 p.m. just to check one thing, or taking on an extra project you don't have space for, pause. Ask yourself, am I working because I want to, or because I don't know what else to do with this silence? Am I pursuing success, or just hiding from a deeper ache I don't have the tools to face? Because the real work, the scary work, isn't always in the office or on the screen. Sometimes, it's in the still, unstructured, non-performative act of facing your own interior world. And for many of us, that's the one meeting we keep rescheduling. The capitalist identity crisis. You are what you produce. At some point, no one knows exactly when, we stopped being people and started becoming resumes. You're no longer just a person with thoughts, dreams, contradictions. You're a high performer, a strategic thinker, a self-starter with a proven track record. And slowly, subtly, your value becomes tied not to who you are, but to what you can produce. Welcome to the capitalist identity crisis, where being isn't enough and doing is never done. Capitalism, at its core, doesn't care about your soul. It cares about your output. It doesn't ask if you're fulfilled, only if you're functioning. You're encouraged to find your passion, but only if it boosts productivity. You're told to follow your dreams, but only if they make money. Even rest is repackaged as recharging for performance. Self-care becomes another tool for better work. Meditation apps are sold with the promise of improved focus, not inner peace. In this system, nothing is sacred. Everything is leverage. And the result? You start relating to yourself like a machine. You check your own stats. You monitor your mood like a KPI. You optimize your morning routine for efficiency, not joy. You look at your free time and think, how can I make this productive? Even hobbies start to feel like side hustles in disguise. Reading, start a book blog. Cooking, launch a YouTube channel. Painting, open an Etsy shop. God forbid you just enjoy something. And underneath it all, the message is clear. Your worth is conditional. Conditional on output, on relevance, on performance. If you're not producing, improving, scaling, you're wasting space. You are only as good as your last project, only as interesting as your LinkedIn profile, only as lovable as your efficiency. This is where things get dangerous. Because when your identity is built on productivity, rest feels like failure. Doing nothing feels like becoming nothing. The moment you stop performing, you stop existing, at least in the eyes of the system. And eventually, you internalize that logic. You become your own manager, your own branding agency, your own motivational speaker. You push yourself harder because what if you fall behind? What if you lose momentum? What if people stop clapping? Even worse, you might start to believe that burnout is a badge of honor. That exhaustion is a sign you're doing it right. That if you're not overwhelmed, you're not trying hard enough. You brag about how busy you are, how little you sleep, how many hours you've logged. It becomes a competition. Who can sacrifice more? Who can care less? Who can pretend to be thriving while secretly unraveling? And yet, behind the perfect productivity facade is often a deep spiritual fatigue. A quiet question most of us don't say out loud. Is this it? Is this what being alive is supposed to feel like? But instead of answering that question, we reach for another project, another metric, another fix. Because capitalism doesn't want introspection, it wants momentum. Reflection slows things down. Self-awareness isn't scalable. Philosophers like Fromm and Marx warned us about this. Fromm called it having versus being. He argued that we've replaced presence with possession. Instead of being wise, we try to have knowledge. Instead of being free, we want to own freedom. And when it comes to work, we don't just do tasks, we become them. Our job title becomes our personality. Our career becomes our character. Marx called it alienation, a state where people become disconnected from their labor, from each other, and most painfully, from themselves. And if you think this only affects CEOs and tech bros, think again. This logic seeps into every corner of life. students who panic when they're not constantly achieving, artists who can't create unless it sells, parents who feel like failures unless every moment is optimized for developmental milestones. The hustle infects everyone. No one is immune. So how do you break the spell? Start by remembering you are not a product. You are not a brand. You are not here to maximize value or disrupt an industry. You are not a spreadsheet of wins and losses. You are a complex, breathing, evolving human being whose value cannot be measured in output. That doesn't mean quit your job or hate capitalism overnight. It means deprogram yourself, gently, quietly. Every time you feel the urge to justify your rest, pause. Every time you call yourself lazy for needing a break, question it. Every time you confuse busyness with worth, breathe. Because here's the radical truth. You have value even when you're still, even when you're not producing, even when the system can't monetize your moment. You exist beyond the metrics. You matter beyond the market. And the more you remember that, the more this strange pressure starts to crack. You begin to feel the difference between movement and meaning, between success and sanity, between a life you've built and a life that's been sold to you. And maybe, just maybe, you'll begin to imagine a version of yourself that doesn't have to be anything other than alive. Existential anxiety and the fear of emptiness. Most people aren't afraid of death. Not really. What they're afraid of is something quieter, harder to name, and much more persistent. Emptiness. That uncomfortable stillness you feel when the noise stops. That hollow space that creeps in on Sunday afternoons between tasks, between goals, when there's nothing left to prove and nowhere urgent to be. And in that silence, something inside whispers, "Now what?" That's existential anxiety. The feeling that beneath all your routines, roles, and responsibilities, there might be nothing. No clear meaning, no guaranteed purpose, just space, raw, open space. And what do we do with that space? We cover it, we fill it, we drown it, with work, with tasks, with more. Because in a world that doesn't teach you how to be, doing becomes your only language. You learn early on that being productive is good, being useful is honorable, and being idle, that's dangerous. That's when the questions come. That's when the quiet gets loud. So you keep moving. Existentialists like Sartre and Camus saw this for what it was, a desperate attempt to escape the void. Camus talked about the absurd, that strange dissonance between our search for meaning and the silence of the universe. He didn't say it to depress you. He said it to wake you up. Because the truth is, most of us are terrified, not that life has no meaning, but that we've never paused long enough to discover one. So instead, we fill the void with tasks, with goals, with color-coded calendars. We work not just to live, but to avoid asking what living actually means. And it's not always conscious. You don't wake up and say, "Today I will suppress my existential dread through administrative tasks." You just get busy. You check your phone, you dive into the next email, you pour yourself into your job, you become irreplaceable. And at night, when the screens go dark, the silence returns, and you repeat. The fear of emptiness is powerful because it threatens our illusion of control. In a structured life, you know your next step. You have goals, schedules, metrics. But emptiness? Emptiness demands that you sit with the unknown, that you face the terrifying possibility that life doesn't come preloaded with answers, that you might have to create meaning from scratch. And that's a kind of freedom most people are not prepared for. Because freedom, real freedom, comes with responsibility. Not the responsibility to achieve, but the responsibility to define. And once you realize that no job, no title, no external structure can do that for you, things start to feel shaky. You might succeed wildly and still feel lost. You might get everything you worked for and still feel like something's missing. That's not failure. That's the soul knocking. And this is why workaholism is so effective. It gives you a role. It gives you structure. It gives you something to wake up for. It hides the question, who am I without this? And that's a terrifying question. Because what if you don't know? What if you've spent so long running that you've forgotten what it feels like to stand still and feel your own existence without a task in hand? But here's the irony. That emptiness you fear, that's where meaning begins. Not in escaping it, but in facing it, in letting it rise and pass through you like a wave. In sitting with the discomfort of not knowing and trusting that something deeper will emerge. Not a slogan, not a mantra, but a real sense of self that doesn't depend on your productivity. Existential thinkers didn't romanticize the void, but they didn't fear it either. They saw it as a kind of reset, a stripping away of illusion, a necessary pause where, without the scaffolding of social expectation or professional identity, you come face to face with your essence. And maybe that essence doesn't come with a perfect pitch or a 5-year plan. Maybe it's messy, unfinished, but it's real. And real is a relief once you stop trying to impress the invisible committee of worthiness you've constructed in your head. So the next time you feel that creeping sense of emptiness, don't rush to silence it. Don't schedule it away. Don't slap a goal on it and pretend it's gone. Sit with it, not as punishment, but as invitation. The invitation to find out who you are when you're not being useful, when you're not performing, when you're not numbing. Because if you never face that emptiness, it will run your life. It will whisper in your ear every time you rest. It will drive you to overcommit, to overwork, to overachieve. Not because you're ambitious, but because you're afraid. And that fear, it doesn't go away until you walk straight into it and discover the strange truth no one wants to say out loud. Emptiness isn't the absence of meaning. It's the space where meaning is waiting to be made. From meaning to mechanism, how passion becomes performance. It always starts innocently enough. You love something, writing, designing, teaching, building, fixing, imagining. You feel alive when you do it. Time disappears. The act feels sacred, like you're touching something real. Something that doesn't need an explanation. You don't think about results. You don't care who's watching. You do it because it's yours. Pure, whole, undivided. And then slowly the world notices. Or maybe you think it might notice. You get good at it. People start asking, have you thought about making this your career? And just like that, your passion gets promoted into a product. This is how meaning becomes mechanism. How what once grounded you in joy slowly morphs into obligation. At first you're flattered, then you're committed, then you're exhausted. You start tracking your progress, you monetize, you optimize, you analyze engagement, you make a content calendar, you build a brand. And the thing you loved quietly becomes a thing you leverage, not because you stopped caring, but because now it has to perform. And the system loves this. It thrives on turning your essence into output, into measurable, repeatable, scalable value. Your creativity becomes a deliverable. Your insight becomes content. Your curiosity becomes a funnel. Capitalism doesn't kill your passion directly. It just hands it a spreadsheet and tells it to prove its worth. So now, what once brought you closer to yourself starts pulling you away. You wake up not asking, what do I want to create today, but what will perform well today? You start to anticipate the reaction before you've even begun the action. You censor yourself. Not out of fear, but out of calculation. You're not chasing truth anymore. You're chasing traction. And here's the heartbreak. You might still be good at it, maybe even better than before, but it feels different, heavier, sharper, less like play, more like pressure. You're not inside the experience. You're watching yourself do it, like a manager hovering over their own joy. You feel tired in a way that no amount of rest seems to fix. This is the cost of performance culture. It doesn't ask you to stop being you. It just asks you to package yourself more efficiently. And if you resist, you're told you're wasting potential. Being unrealistic, not scaling. Passion in this world must justify itself with productivity. Otherwise, it's self-indulgence. Even worse, this logic infects not just work, but identity. You're not just a teacher, you're a thought leader. Not just a painter, you're a content creator. Not just someone who loves philosophy, you're now a personal brand in the self-awareness space. And if you don't want to play the game, you're not authentic. You're irrelevant. We start believing that the only things worth doing are the things that generate results. And that means we lose the art of doing something just because it matters to us, just because it feels alive, just because it brings us back to something honest. This isn't a call to quit your job or reject all forms of ambition. It's a call to notice the moment when your passion starts bending to perform, when the joy of the process is replaced by the burden of outcome, when the sacred becomes strategic, when the why gets drowned out by the how many. Because there's a quiet tragedy in turning everything meaningful into work. Not just because it leads to burnout, but because it leads to alienation. You forget why you started. You forget what it felt like before it had to be efficient. And most painfully, you forget how to return to it without guilt. So maybe freedom doesn't mean giving up on passion. Maybe it means reclaiming it. Reclaiming the right to do things badly, to do things slowly, to do things that don't scale. Maybe it means letting some of your life be unmonetized, untracked, unapplauded, free from the lens of performance. Because when everything you love becomes something you must do, you lose the ability to hear your inner voice. And in its place, you hear metrics, deadlines, projections. But the soul doesn't speak in charts, it speaks in feelings, in quiet urges, in things that can't be optimized without losing their shape. So ask yourself honestly, when did the thing you loved become another task? When did joy become data? When did the work you once did for yourself become something you only do to yourself? And what would it take to step back, not forever but just enough, to remember what it felt like before it had to be useful? Sometimes, the most radical act in a performance-driven world is to do something real without needing anyone to see it, to create something without posting it, to follow an idea just because it matters to you, to make space for things that aren't productive but are true. And in that quiet defiance, you might just find that your passion isn't gone. It's just been waiting for you to stop turning it into a job. Stillness as resistance, reclaiming life beyond labor. In a world that never stops moving, stillness becomes suspicious. If you're not working, not optimizing, not chasing the next milestone, what are you even doing with your life? We've been trained to treat rest as a luxury, leisure as guilt, and stillness as laziness. Because in a system that profits from your exhaustion, slowing down isn't just frowned upon, it's radical. It's resistance. And in that stillness, something dangerous happens. You start to feel human again. Not efficient, not productive, not on brand, just human. But stillness is hard, not because it's physically demanding, but because it confronts everything we've been taught to avoid. The racing thoughts, the unfinished grief, the fear of irrelevance, the echo of voices saying you should be doing more, being more, proving more. Stillness isn't quiet, it's loud. It forces you to listen to the parts of yourself that don't show up on calendars. The parts that are inconvenient, slow, non-performative, and deeply real. And that's exactly why it matters. Capitalism has mastered the art of keeping you moving. Not because it cares where you're going, but because motion keeps you from asking uncomfortable questions. Questions like, what if my worth has nothing to do with my work? What if my constant busyness is actually avoidance? What if the life I've built is stunningly impressive, but emotionally hollow? Stillness threatens the system because it allows you to see. And once you see, really see, you might not go back. You might not accept burnout as normal. You might start questioning why you've been working 10-hour days for a vague sense of future security. You might stop believing that happiness is just on the other side of one more promotion, one more launch, one more achievement. And that's a problem for the machine, because people who are still begin to remember themselves. They remember joy without justification. They remember play without purpose. They remember conversations that aren't transactional, afternoons that aren't scheduled, mornings that start with curiosity instead of urgency. Stillness reconnects you to life before it was sliced into slots of productivity. But here's the trap. We think we have to earn it, that we can only rest once we've proved our value. That silence is only allowed once we've contributed enough noise. It's the same logic that makes vacations stressful and weekends feel stolen. You lie down and immediately start mentally accounting for whether you deserve the moment. The very act of resting becomes another task to manage. So how do we reclaim stillness, not as a temporary escape, but as a fundamental right? Start by refusing to measure your life in units of output. Let go of the myth that doing nothing means being nothing. Let go of the reflex to fill every space. Create time that isn't strategic, space that isn't optimized, conversations that aren't recorded, moments that are just lived. This doesn't mean quitting everything. It means rewiring your relationship to doing. It means no longer asking, is this useful, and starting to ask, is this honest? Because some of the most important things you'll ever feel, know, or realize will happen in spaces with no purpose at all. Stillness teaches you that you don't have to earn your place in the world. You already have it. You exist, and that is enough. And once you believe that, not just intellectually, but in your bones, you become a little less easy to manipulate, a little less reactive, a little less available to systems that only value you when you're producing. And ironically, that's when your actions start to matter more. Not because they're loud or strategic, but because they come from wholeness. Not fear, not obligation, but a deep sense of alignment. You stop performing and start living. You stop chasing and start choosing. Stillness doesn't make you less effective. It makes you clear. It gives you access to parts of yourself that constant motion has blurred. And in that clarity, you might remember what you've always known but were too busy to feel. That life is not something you conquer, it's something you experience. And that experience, it's happening now. Not after the next deadline, not at some imaginary finish line. Now, in this breath, in this moment, in the stillness you were taught to fear, but is quietly waiting for you to come home. If you feel exhausted but still can't stop, maybe you're not just tired, maybe you're afraid. Afraid that if you stop working, you'll have to face the silence, the uncertainty, the ache of not knowing who you are when you're no longer useful. But here's the truth. You are more than your output. You are not a machine. You are not a brand. You are not a checklist of achievements. You are a human being, messy, contradictory, beautifully unfinished. Real rest isn't laziness. It's rebellion in a system that profits from your disconnection. The courage isn't in keeping busy. It's in stopping and seeing what's still there when the noise fades. You, still here, still worthy. If this video made you stop, even for a second, don't scroll past. Share it with someone who needs to hear that their value isn't measured in hours worked. Leave a comment below. What are you really working to avoid? Subscribe for more honest, reflective content on the hidden structures shaping our lives. This channel isn't about productivity hacks. It's about permission to be human. Let's unlearn the noise, together.